Few people have been able to continue a career online without self-censoring. Many people have to dull the edge of their content in order to remain relevant or even have any income on the internet these days. However, one man seems to have been able to achieve a consistent, successful career while also speaking completely freely, at times even openly mocking people for things that would normally get you banned on most platforms. This man not only is able to remain online, but thrive there. Today we are talking about Mike David, the host of Redbar Radio. So to begin, who is Mike David of Redbar? If you have been around on the deeper cooler side of the internet or listening to shock jock radio for the past 2 decades, you have probably heard about, or literally heard from, Redbar Radio's host Mike David. If you haven't heard of Mike, it's more than likely your favorite comedians and podcasters have, although they may not admit that. Mike David is a relatively popular podcast and radio personality. He had started podcasting and doing internet radio long before it was considered cool. Where now everyone has a podcast, Mike is truly a pioneer and unique voice in an oversaturated sea of Joe Rogan wannabes. If never have heard of Mike David or Redbar Radio, Joe Rogan is a good comparison, but where Rogan makes content for mass appeal, Mike strives towards a particular niche, tackling smaller, internet-based issues and perhaps being just a tiny bit more controversial. Mike David may not be the biggest influencer or internet personality out there, but he has been turning heads for quite a long time. Today we will be exploring the life, career, and what made Mike David, host of Redbar Radio, such an infamous internet figure. Humble beginnings. Mike David is a producer from Chicago, Illinois. Prior to his big break with Redbar, he just recorded him and his friends talking and reacting to things online as if they were doing a radio show. He started producing and hosting the Redbar podcast out of his apartment in 2003 and quickly gained popularity and notoriety. The goal of the podcast was to do prank calls, talk with guests about random stuff, and be a show anyone would fear to be the target of, but still couldn't help but listen to. Over time, the show grew, and as the podcast scene expanded with the likes of Joe Rogan, internet personalities and comedians started to emerge, Mike decided he had to take a stance. It was clear from the beginning that Mike David was influenced by popular shock jocks of radio, such as Howard Stern and Anthony Cumia, who would later partner with him. Because he was just starting out, he hit the ground running. He was able to constantly put out content in episodes 5 days a week. From the very beginning, Mike's content was clearly not for everyone. It was offensive, had no limits on what can and can't be said, and no one was safe. The show evolved past just childish prank calls and headed more towards tackling these comedians, podcasters, internet personalities, trends, and political commentators. Mike had decided to take a stand against those he saw as fools. Mostly comedians he felt didn't deserve their success or who he believed cheated in some way. Many believe this may be a revenge path for Mike, who had tried a career in comedy. It is believed he had aspersions to be a comic himself, but that dream didn't work out for him. He also opened a short-lived comedy club. Some wonder if he became bitter and now has a vendetta against the industry that didn't care for him. Whatever it was, Mike could not leave anyone be, and he would make fun of anyone and everyone. Pretty much no one was safe. Over time, Mike became well known for his wit, raunchy comedy, rudeness, attacks, and being completely cold and unable to get unnerved in extreme situations. Attraction and adversity. You could say that Mike liked to ruffle feathers, and it was very obvious. His pranks, calls, and antics led to some extremities such as threats of being reported to the police, having his calls traced, and facing extreme reactions to what he did. Despite all of that, he still seemed completely unfazed by everything that happened. In a weird way that may have made him more popular, the internet had become more and more obsessed with those who challenged mainstream mediocrity and were outspoken about their controversial views without fear of offending someone. This is something that has become increasingly rare in the landscape of today. It is hard to find anyone that is willing to say anything rude or that could be considered out of turn, as just entertaining the thought of something controversial could end a career. But Mike never caved into censoring himself, and a section of the internet respected that. Many feel that Mike may have not been in this to be a noble fighter of internet justice or free speech, but that he just wanted to annoy people and make fun of them. That kind of personality is what drew listeners to him. similar to how Joe Rogan promotes this very classic macho ideology of eating game meat, smoking weed, lifting, and fighting. Mike attracted his audience by being a sort of satirical commentator or jester about events and situations that were really not that serious. He's like an investigative journalist. He is the Fletch of the comedy podcasts. If you were following the comedy side of internet trends and celebrities, you would more than likely share in some of his extreme criticism of it. Just like in any industry or group, if you pay attention to it enough, you notice when things are off. Mike seems to feel that if things are off, and they need policing, he truly is one of the few people that can or is will to call out those in the comedy world. He's very good at it, too. He has a spidey sense for those that are messed up in the community. Oftentimes, he even calls out people before a scandal about them is public. This skill is what amassed such a following, by targeting a very specific niche and tackling lesser-known celebrities or personalities like Michael Bauer, Chrissy Mayer, Josh Denny, Patrick Melton, and Mike Skeel. Over the years, Redbar grew and Mike started having a bigger role. Redbar started out as a simple podcast, but people attached to the project started to become more famous. Redbar had some guests that are now bigger celebrities, like T.J. Miller, Drew Michael, and Hannibal Buress. So the project was certainly attracting talented people. Eventually Mike was able to expand with separate projects like the Redbar Nobody Likes Hot Dogs TV special, the Redbar New Music Show, the Melton Watch, Redbar, Dawn Syndrome, Anthony Cumia's New Nightmare, and more. At one point, Redbar even had a comedy club in Chicago, but unfortunately that did not last, due to drama between him and his business partner, Kyle Lane. Later, Kyle would sue Mike for defamation. It's undeniable how Redbar has grown and created a popular platform, but his popularity and the reason for it could have been what made him become more intense. He takes a very hard stance that seems to have evolved into something that could be seen as pretty much the opposite of the modern-day standards of social justice. On his show, you'll hear words you seem to never be able to hear anywhere else. Saying things that could be considered out of line is nothing to be surprised by when watching. Mike has no issue with using slurs on protected groups. When he started changing how he presented his show and becoming more hostile, the show became more about outright attacking people for long periods of time per episode, often spending hours on just one person and just making fun of them. One could fairly call Mike David a bully. Still, his fan base grew and continues to grow. He even got so popular that he gave prizes and cash to viewers, or is it listeners? This is actually a major conundrum. If you listen the audio only, you're a listener, but if you watch the video itself of the recording, are you a viewer? Much to think about. The compound media conundrum. Around 2015, Mike Redbar David partnered up with Anthony Cumia's Compound Media, and the show grew even further during that brief period. However, that was very short-lived, as unsurprisingly, Mike did what Mike does, and he caused problems and made enemies. Mike was heavily criticizing or trashing hosts and personnel connected to Compound Media, such as Mike Finioa and the business Deep Discount. Mike was told to stop and that it would be in his best interest to avoid trashing those on quote-unquote their side. That line of thinking was not something Mike agreed with, as it is important to Mike to call out those he sees as fools when he sees them. So he continued to mock all those he saw fit, even if they were in his network. This led to problems between Mike David and Anthony Cumia, where David criticized the network for not being all about free speech as it should be. Eventually, Redbar and Compound Media had to cut their connections, and Mike became primarily on his subscription site, Redbar Radio. To no one's surprise, Cumia became the target of his following disses and attacks, with several segments about him such as calling him Count Cumia and diving deep into possible scandals or history. Mike's greatest battles. Over the years, Mike got into quite a few heated rivalries with comedians or influencers that he tackled or made fun of. One of Mike David's greatest adversaries was Sam Tripoli. Sam was the subject of much of Mike's jokes and disses, and it even got as far as singing a humiliating song about his children. This angered Sam so bad that he allegedly hired a private investigator to find Redbar's address and went there, demanding that Mike meet him. On the intercom, Sam yelled profanities at Mike and promised that he would get him. Of course, Mike was completely unshaken, as usual. In one of his videos about accepting a charity boxing match, Mike said, "Even guys you see who go after me, they hate me. Unless I hate them, I don't go after them." Another person that Mike went after hard was Chris D'Elia. Chris D'Elia was a successful comedian. However, after some sexual misconduct allegations, his career took a nosedive, and he became an easy bullseye for guys like Mike to completely go after. On his podcast, Mike directed several attacks at Chris D'Elia and criticized the way he cried and used his tears to manipulate the audience. Mike also condemned D'Elia's use of his own children and how much he loves them to elicit sympathy from the audience. Of course, Mike did this in a very crude and Mike Y way. Mike David has also gone after well-known internet celebrities Mike Majlak, Michaela Peterson, Tim Dillon, and Joe Rogan. A health crisis. Recently, Mike David developed and suffered from a strange autoimmune disease that we're still not quite sure about the nature of. The disease affected his entire body, and he said that he could barely get out of bed for nearly a year. Most of it was burying my head into a pillow, screaming from morning till night, he said. The disease caused him to take a break from the show in May 2021 for about a year, but recently, he has started up a new studio and getting back into the show. Surprisingly, there is a conspiracy theory that David was hiding out in Tucson, Arizona. Conclusion. Love him or hate him, Mike David is a perplexing figure. In the modern day age of so many different types of internet and media personalities, you can find a broad spectrum of. Mike still has an avid fan base and his show is still running, so that must mean he does have people who like him. On Facebook, he even has a dedicated fan group called the Bring Back Group. On the other hand, while some like him, a lot don't. He's been called a narcissist, a baby, a waste, and so much worse. A lot of people simply can't condone his type of humor and extreme reaction to things, such as his song making fun of Sam Tripoli's children. Overall, with how much adversity and crudeness gets views these days, it's understandable how someone like Mike David gained popularity, and how many will follow in his footsteps.